My name's Rose Cullis, and this story is called Reconciliation, and it opens with a poem of the same name. 1. Word over all, beautiful as the sky, beautiful that war and all its deeds of carnage must in time be utterly lost, that the hands of the sisters death and night incessantly, softly, wash again and ever again this soiled world. For my enemy is dead, a man divine as myself is dead. I look where he lies, white-faced and still in the coffin. I draw near. I bend down and touch lightly with my lips the white face in the coffin. Walt Whitman. 2. Even before he died, Sophie realized that she was actually a lot like her father. She had to acknowledge that she could feel him in her body, in her intensity and irritability, and in her crippling concern with the opinions of others. After his death, Sophie allowed herself to imagine him as an ally sometimes, and to believe that he could hear her thoughts as if she were whispering them to him. In those moments, it seemed like her father was leaning in and really listening to her in a way he never seemed able to when he was alive. Get out of public school teaching, she imagined Joseph saying sympathetically. Get out now. Her father hadn't been able to get out. He had a wife and family to support and couldn't risk throwing away the paycheck or the pension that people immediately remarked on when they heard what his job was. When he was finally able to retire and subject to less relentless anxiety, he realized his shaking hands were possibly more than nerves. He went to see a doctor who diagnosed Parkinson's. That night, he lay in bed beside his wife Trish, full of horror. What a way to go, stiffening into paralysis, losing his voice, losing, eventually, his ability to even swallow. How strange to be a body and subject to these grotesque ends, he thought. When he was finally free, to have it come to this. In his grief, Joseph turned to his garden. He preferred the personalities of tough and waxy hostas, of soft lamb's ear, of discerning clematis, of silly and extravagant bergamot, like characters in Dr. Seuss picture books, he said, to the demands and terrors of intimacy with people. When Sophie came to visit him in those days, they would go into the large backyard and admire the garden together. He'd lean on her with so much trust it moved her, given what had happened between them. Sophie would look up and see her mother watching them from the kitchen window. She waved to Trish as if to say, "Here we are, everything's all right." Beside her, Joseph pointed at each plant with a crooked finger and named it. Sophie nodded in response and made the kind of careful, self-conscious comments people make at art exhibits. As Joseph's Parkinson's advanced and reduced his walk to a shuffle, his wit became more pronounced. He made jokes about his condition in his slurred speech and whispered to his wife or one of his daughters about the necessity of leaving any social event as soon as he'd arrived, because of the time involved in making an exit, he said. They sang marching songs to manage passing through thresholds his brain balked at. 3. On the night of Joseph's death, Sophie's older sister Caddy called to break the news. That Caddy was phoning at all was remarkable, and Sophie sat up in bed when she heard her voice on the other end. Although they weren't exactly estranged, they weren't close. Things had gone wrong between them once, and they were both wary. "Dad's dead," Caddy said simply. That night, Joseph had stopped partway up the staircase on his way to bed, Caddy told Sophie, retelling their mother's story about the events, and coughed what looked like coffee grounds, but was actually blood from an esophageal hemorrhage. He'd somehow made his way back down to his wheelchair at the bottom of the stairs and died there. Their mother knew when he was gone, she said, from the way his eyes emptied. Then he slid off the chair. And so it happened the way death does, with a brutal and intimate strangeness. They weren't even using euphemisms for it yet. There it is, Sophie thought. It's done then. They'd all been afraid their long-suffering mother would die first, and were terrified of the precedent she'd set in her attention to their father's needs. All the sisters, there were 3 of them, had strange attachments to their father, unresolved business. His needs and moods and penchants had been eccentric and excessive, and had always dominated the household. Even though his demands made more sense later, in the context of his disease, they still felt that they needed to be careful, to hold back. It wasn't clear how much Joseph sensed his daughter's reticence to take care of him. He needed and wanted his wife Trish most of all. Dealing with other people had always troubled him. It was an anxiety that was rigid and intractable. Joseph allowed for no replacement for his wife as his disease progressed. By the time he died, Trish desperately needed knee surgery for arthritis and was developing a heart problem. That her great heart might give way made sense. 4. That night, Sophie slept with her mother. Her other 2 sisters were married and she was single again, so it made sense. Trish and Joseph had been apart together for over 60 years and had almost never slept apart. Sophie lay in her father's place in bed, and her mother told her that what really broke her heart is that Joseph didn't want to die. Despite being almost completely paralyzed, he wanted to live. He wanted to live! Sophie's mother cried out into the darkness, where they lay together with the sheets tucked up under their chins. And then, because it was somewhere in the air between them, Trish said, "When your father thought he'd hurt you girls, he felt so badly." Suddenly they heard a strange noise down in the kitchen. "What's that?" Trish asked Sophie. The 2 of them made their way down the stairs to check it out. They walked around the portion of the carpet the men had cut away earlier in the evening because it was stained with Joseph's blood. In the kitchen they found the radio on. "That's strange," Trish said, and turned it off. Back upstairs in bed, they heard it start up again. This time, Sophie and her mother held hands as they went down in the dark and turned on the light in the kitchen. The radio was blaring some soft rock song. It felt empty and even garish, like elevator music. "I'm sorry, darling," Trish said, and pulled out the plug. Sophie was given the task of writing the eulogy. Although she worked as a public school teacher, she occasionally made a little money on the side writing short stories and essays. Also, Sophie was an extrovert, despite her practice of a craft that seemed to favor introverts, and her sisters were shy about public attention. Sophie was happy to do it, and took her job seriously. She focused on their beloved mother and her grief, and found a way to sing her father's praises. The writing felt easy to do, as if her effort had a mystical rightness. "My father was born with a call," Sophie began, and at the ceremony, her mother looked up with a radiant face, while her middle daughter told a story of a husband's love. Her sisters, on either side of her mother, were full of grief and confusion. Their faces looked attentive, but stunned by their task. At the end of the piece, Sophie quoted Keats, Joseph's favorite poet. "Can death be sleep when life is but a dream?" But it was another poem, Reconciliation, that obsessed Sophie and made her determined to undertake a very particular ritual with the body of the father she'd once battled with. She knew it was a misunderstanding of Whitman's poem, but she also believed the poem contained a hidden charm that directed her to take an action after her father's death that would have mystical and sacred consequences. She wanted to kiss his dead face and seal something between them. She told no one about this. 6. Sophie and Joseph had found a kind of peace together in his later years that had nothing to do with processing what had happened between them and everything to do with confusion and exhaustion. In fact, the trouble between them had taught Sophie to accept the idea that sometimes things just don't make sense or can't be worked out, and she'd committed instead to cauterizing the hacked limbs of her sense of justice over wrongs she felt she'd endured. Over the years, her father often became sad and even penitent about the past. Every time Sophie left, he cried and whispered into her neck, "Forgive me," while she patted his bony back. Sophie dreaded these exits. They felt demanding, like a scene enacted for pity, rather than something provoked by genuine remorse. Joseph's body was going to be cremated, but first it was prepared and laid in a coffin for the funeral. Trish picked the polished coffin that was slated for burning and declared that although she knew her husband would not want people staring at him dead, she thought it was a good idea for the immediate family to have a brief viewing before the ceremony. For Sophie, this was her chance. She almost lost it. On the day of the funeral, she found herself in terrible traffic. The off-ramp, in particular, wasn't moving. It was a dark day, and the ceremony was way out in the furthest suburbs. Sophie lived downtown and didn't time it right, as usual. She could see the funeral home from the exit sign of the highway, right beside Tim Hortons and Eastside Mario's Pizza. And if she hadn't been driving, she would have ditched the car and run to make sure she didn't lose her opportunity for the viewing. By the time she got there, the coffin was closed. "I'll see if they can open it up for you after the service," her mother said. Trish could see that Sophie looked desperate. And they did. After the service, after Sophie had delivered the eulogy, she was led into a side room, and the coffin was opened. She bent in and kissed the dead face of a man who had been her enemy, of a man as divine as herself. Her father's pickled flesh was hard and cold against her mouth, but her sense of urgency was warm and alive, and the kiss confirmed the strange pact that had already been initiated between the quick and the dead in their relationship. Her father agreed to help her in exchange for a more compassionate assessment of who and what he'd been to her when he was alive and kicking. Sophie realized that she too would die, and that this man deserved a reckoning that had nothing to do with revenge and its ecstatic excesses. She wondered if this was forgiveness.